Hey, obviously it's been a little while. Nothing too drastic happened other than that I got married in September and then I was on my honeymoon for close to a month, which was really nice in New Orleans. But apart from that, there was like 6 months where I was just really, really busy with my job and a lot busier than I expected to be. So I got less time to read, less time to record, less time to edit, and basically I did none of it. I did manage to read 23 books in that time, which was less than I was kind of averaging before. But of those 23, I have seven that I'd like to kind of wrap up and share with you as the ones I enjoyed the most of that pile. So without too much further ado, let's just get into it. So the first one that I read was Shrill by Lindy West. I actually got to go to the book, I guess you would say book launch of it, where she spoke at the Fox Club in Vancouver. And it was a really fun night where people got to ask her questions about the book or things that had inspired her, or more specifically, things she had kind of gone through at Jezebel or at The Guardian or at The Stranger, and different experiences that had kind of led up to the book. As for the book itself, I did really enjoy it. There were a lot of passages that were fun and that were interesting. I think a lot of people talk about her as, say, a fat activist or somebody who's a body positivity activist. That is definitely the work of hers that I've identified with the most, and that I think she seems sort of the freshest and the most interesting about, and is kind of one of the only voices doing this on such a large scale, no pun intended, and on a scale where you really feel like she connects with the material, and it never feels sappy and it never feels overdone, but it always feels really, I guess important sounds corny, but that is kind of how it feels to me. Um, those sections, as usual, really good. I think, as much as I enjoyed the book as a whole, I think that there were a few parts that just felt like her kind of answering critics in a way that I found a little bit disappointing. Like there is an entire chapter where she talks about, she made criticisms about rape jokes in comedy, and then she did have a huge swarm of comedy fans, misogynists, come after her for it. That passage, it was a lot of stuff that I already knew that had happened, and she essentially used it as a way to take a debate that she'd had with the comedian Jim Norton during that time and basically redo her answers. And I understood the concept behind it because she does explain a lot that she was flustered, that that people I think in the audience were booing her or were clearly on Jim Norton's side, that she felt so overwhelmed with the swarm of people who'd been negative about her. But all in all, like it did kind of feel like she was just asking for a redo, as opposed to saying, here's why I stand by the comments I made and here's more about them. It felt a little bit more defensive than I think it should have, because ultimately I think she was making good points and she should have stood by them, which for the most part she was, but it still felt somehow like she was kind of saying, oh, this wasn't good enough, so let me redo it. Having said that, there were tons and tons of passages that I loved. Obviously, one of the biggest sections I think that got shared around was the part about her talking about positive fat female role models in television, and she makes a joke about, I think, I want to say it's not Baloo because it's the other bear, but I think it's the other bear in Robin Hood dressed as a woman, being like the most voluptuous, sexy, fat female character that she had, and of course it's a guy playing a girl. A lot of stuff in there is really funny. Um, and a lot of it is really truthful and really affecting, but more than anything, there were quite a few misses. And as a whole, I mean, as much as I'm recommending it because I do think it was funny, I think it was a good book, there were things I would have liked to have seen her do better, if that makes sense. So that was the first one. That's Shrill by Lindy West. I'm going to hopefully have everything up either here or here. I haven't decided yet. As opposed to kind of showing books, because I usually read these on e-reader, and that was one that I had pre-ordered pretty much as soon as I heard it was coming out. So that's number one. Number two is a play that I read also on e-reader. I don't usually read plays for the obvious reason that plays, for the most part, are meant to be seen as opposed to read. But this was one that I've always loved. It is Shakespeare, my apologies, but it's Much Ado About Nothing. For the most part, I wanted to read it because it is one of his plays that I think has the most kind of fun and exciting language, especially in the interplay of people just talking. And it is a play, for the most part, about people just interacting, and how lively and how fun he does make that. Obviously, I don't need to positively review Shakespeare. I think that's been done. I don't think too many people are going to disagree with it. But what I will say is that because my job now involves a lot of writing and it involves a lot of quick, funny, acerbic, um, just sort of catchy writing, that was a really helpful thing to read to kind of get on that page when you are doing more technical writing, as funny as that sounds. So Shakespeare, nobody's going to disagree with that. Big recommendation, big surprise, etc. Number 3 was a recommendation from Lena at Just Kiss My Frog, and that was Eat, Sweat, Play by Anna Kessel. I recommend it for pretty much the same reason that Lena did, that I think you forget, especially as a woman, and when you're going into adulthood, how much fun sports are and how much perhaps women have been dissuaded from enjoying sports because all the exercise that we're encouraged to do is about making your body look better, making your body look more fit and more toned, and you take away just the fun aspect of getting out there and having a good time and kicking a ball around. I will say it did inspire me to get back into sports, and so I've been running, which is one of the things actually the author talks about, how she ran while pregnant and how people's hand wringing about women running while I'm not pregnant, but women running while pregnant is sort of one of those things that also polices women's bodies, especially when it comes to exercise. So that was very, very interesting, and it did get me back into it. I'm also looking at joining the Vancouver women's soccer team when the season starts, but unfortunately it starts like next fall. So if only I had read the book a little bit earlier, but oh well. But very much recommended. I think it kind of seemed to lull a little bit in the middle, and there were definitely points at which you kind of felt like I get what you're saying here. I think you've made this point several times. But having said that, I think the most interesting chapters were about the Olympian who got a gold medal after having given birth, especially with the way we talk about women pre, post, and perinatal, of women needing to be in the best physical condition, and then us hand wringing about how women shouldn't exercise while pregnant, or should they, or how should they, how intense should it be, and then once they give birth, even going into things that I think should have been top of mind and yet weren't because I'm not a parent yet. Things like, where do you put your kids when you're exercising, either at the gym or at home, or how do you fit in that time once you're a parent? But then also, what is the relationship with your body once you've given birth that has to be considered? And all of that was really interesting, coming from both a parent and somebody who's just talking about women's fitness in general. So again, highly, highly recommended. It's not just for new mothers. It has information for anyone from childhood up into their senior years. I think it was a really, really good book. Again, kind of sags a little bit in the middle because you do feel like, I've heard this. But apart from that, I think it was really good. The number 4 is Why God is a Woman by Nin Andrews. This was recommended by Jen Campbell a few months ago. It is just really beautiful. It's a series of poems about a fictional island in which women reign supreme, so it is a matriarchy. It positions men as being the weaker sex in all of the ways that we talk about women being the weaker sex now. So men are obsessed with their looks. All of the women are to be revered. There are just a number, and I believe that there's a section in which the men grow beautiful wings, but if their wings start to molt, then they're seen as less attractive and they have to kind of be taken away from society, or they're not really valuable to society anymore, which can obviously be seen as a direct interaction with the way that we treat women's bodies and when they get older or when they again have children. So working back in the last recommendation. It was very, very beautiful. It's hard to describe. You kind of just do have to read it. It is a series of poems, but it read more like a collection of very short stories to me than poems. I think the only one I didn't like was All Women Look Like Angelina Jolie, just because it felt like there was something kind of goofy about that. But everything else I think came off really beautifully and worked really well. The next one I read on audiobook, and this is becoming a bit of a theme. So I will be doing a series about classics on audiobooks and kind of separating each of these individually because, and I actually got a few comments on my channel when I was off that I forgot to respond to, which was really bad. I'm sorry. But I got quite a few comments about how classics are often easier to enjoy on audiobook. And there's a lot of discussion around, is audiobook lazy? Is it just that you're not taking the time to actually read something? But to be honest, in much the same way that a play needs to be performed, certain classics you can get more out of if you have someone, particularly an actor. I did find the ones that were read by professional actors to be a little bit more engaging than the ones that were read by, say, just normal voice actors, if that makes sense. And I think that they do give more characterization to it, but you do get more out of it. If anything, what you could look at it as a way of getting into classics, especially if you find them intimidating. But I've always loved classics. I studied the 19th century, and I still found it more fun to kind of go through this with different sort of creaky voices. Speaking of creaky voices, And Then There Were None is read by Dan Stevens, who's best known for Downton Abbey. He played Cousin Matthew. But if you really want to see him in something great, he was in a movie called The Guest a few years ago that is very, very funny. If you like John Carpenter movies, it's really, really similar to those, and it's intentionally so. It's got quite an 80s theme and an 80s score to it. Not great for people who don't like gore. There are things that you could read in it as misogynistic, but it felt more like it was intentionally an 80s throwback than anything else. And if anything, Dan Stevens is the most sexualized person in it. But putting that aside, it's an extra recommendation. Yeah, the actual book itself was really good. I saw the Christmas miniseries that was put on by the BBC last year at Christmas with Aidan Turner. That was very good, and so I did want to read the original source material. It was very good. Dan Stevens is a particularly good voice actor for this kind of thing, and I think for anyone who doesn't know him outside of Downton Abbey, he also often judges the Man Booker Prize. I believe he runs a literary magazine with a friend of his, so he is quite steeped in literature. It's not just that they got a famous voice to read a book. And his characterization of the characters is quite fun. He does do that unfortunate thing that male actors seem to when they are reading a female voice, where it sounds a little bit too breathy and silly. But for the characters he was doing, it actually kind of worked, so I wasn't too upset about it. And there's no reason to be upset, but you get my point. That was the main thing with And Then There Were None. It was fun. It was atmospheric. I did listen to that quite a bit while I was on vacation, especially on the plane and so on. But that one was just a lot of fun. So if you are going to read it, I definitely recommend the audiobook as well. The next one I also read on audiobook, and it was Pride and Prejudice. I have read Pride and Prejudice a number of times on a physical book. This one was read by... I've been trying now for several minutes to remember her name, and I just can't do it. And it's going to hit me as soon as I finish recording. I know it. But anyway, she played Miranda Frost. She was Jane in The Pride and Prejudice from 2005, and she was most recently in Gone Girl. She's really good. It's not that I can't remember her name because I don't like her, but anyway. Her reading is really good. It's not quite as good as Juliet Stevenson's in Sense and Sensibility. I thought Juliet Stevenson really brought that book to life, where there were things about this person's narration. I'm really going to have to remember her name at some point. But there was something about her narration that was solid, but not necessarily quite as good as I would have hoped. And she also does a little bit too much of the, like, if a character needs a different voice, they sort of get a silly voice as opposed to just a slightly altered one. But all in all, it was good. I do think, and I will talk about this more when I kind of break out into the separate audiobook versions of classics, there were definitely things in the book that rereading it now, I still love it, but it's almost like I love the characters less than I used to, particularly the two leads. So I will get into more of why that is. It didn't really have to do with the audiobook in particular, although I think that there were things that were highlighted by the audio that I may have skimmed more in the reading that really brought that out. And then the last one is kind of a surprise. So I picked that up at a Vancouver bookstore that had it as one of their recommended reads. So on the recommended shelf was a book by Liane Moriarty, who I've never heard before. She's an Australian author, and it was called What Alice Forgot. It's not normally the kind of book that I'd like, and the main reason is I get very, very bored very quickly of the people in the suburbs have more complex lives than you'd assume type of book. But regardless, I think it did more interesting things with that concept than the average type of life in the suburbs book. I'm thinking particularly of things like Little Children, which I really didn't like despite liking the movie. I think it was really interesting. I want to say right off the top that I did enjoy it, and I was gripped from the first little bit, mostly because it did do a series of cliffhangers at each chapter. Nothing too extreme, nothing too manipulative, but it was kind of like as she's trying to remember the course of the last 10 years, there will be sort of a cliffhanger of, don't you know you're getting a divorce, or don't you know you don't talk to that person anymore, or her mysterious friend Gina, who appears to have died, but she doesn't know exactly what her relationship was with Gina and why everyone seems to be tiptoeing around Gina as a person in her life. So it was really interesting. I think that there are a few call-outs I'd like to make. If you are currently dealing with infertility, I probably would give this a miss. I think it is something that would bother you, particularly in the way it wraps up a couple of storylines at the end. Her sister is, in the book, dealing with infertility, and I think that there are ways that that is approached, even though you can tell it's trying to be sympathetic, that often comes off as patronizing or a little bit difficult. With that said, I don't know if the author has had a personal relationship with it. I myself have not had an issue with it. It was just something where, like I said, particularly in the way it wraps up, I feel like it will come off as unsympathetic or difficult. The other thing being, I think in the latter part of it, it devolves a little bit too much into, making houses, if that makes sense. Like, it's a little bit too cutesy, especially with her youngest daughter character. Especially because up until that point, it didn't ever feel edgy. It's not an edgy book, but it was kind of going off at a good comic clip, and then it just turns into, I'm making a big pie and my kids are cute. And that part didn't feel tonally quite the same as the first part. So that is everything that I've read while I've been off that I would recommend. I know it seems like I got a little bit negative there, but usually I have some criticisms for the things I read, and there wasn't anything that I necessarily loved apart from Why God is a Woman, and then things that I've read before that I just really enjoy and I was happy to read again, especially through an audiobook format. But yeah, so that's everything for now. I will be following up at some point with the audiobook classics individual section, so I'll be going into kind of more of why I think that they pull out the story better, especially if you're looking for ways to get into classics and you can find them a little bit impenetrable, or if you're just looking for a new way to enjoy them, which is the thing that I've really been enjoying. So that's it for now. Hopefully we'll be seeing each other soon. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe, do that. If you want to leave me a comment, that's probably the best thing you can do because I love having discussions afterwards. So either way, like I said, hope to see you soon, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.